What's up, guys? This is Jan for Chess24. We keep following the most exciting candidates race not involving Donald Trump this year. Of course, I'm talking about the candidates tournament in Moscow, where they played the second round. In this video, we're gonna cover the game between Sergei Karjakin and Hikaru Nakamura. Let's introduce the players. Sergei Karjakin, second lowest rated player in the field at only 2760. But he's a guy who can win the big tournaments, is the reigning World Cup winner, and he did also win the Norway chess tournament twice. He did finish second in the last candidates tournament to Vishy Anand, so he's been there and almost done that. I don't think one should count him out. Magnus Carlsen also mentioned him as one of his favorites to win the event. Hikaru Nakamura has been called a favorite by many. At 2790, one of the highest rated guys in the world, of course. He is new to the stage, however. He's never played in a candidates tournament, and we have yet to see how he's gonna deal with the chance to qualify for a match against his nemesis, Magnus Carlsen. So let's get to the game. Nakamura with the black pieces. Karjakin opens with 1d4, as he did in his first round game, which he drew against Peter Svidler. Karjakin used to be more of an e4 player, but like most of these top guys, he's very, very flexible in the opening. Nakamura is flexible as well, and for this game he chooses knight f6, c4, e6, also big expert of the King's Indian, but maybe he deemed it not solid enough for the early stages of such a tournament. e6, most top players tend to prefer knight f3 to knight c3, which normally is met with a Nimzo Indian. Therefore, knight f3 is what Karjakin chooses, and here the first surprise for me, the move b6. The move itself is not surprising. The Queen's Indian defense is a well-established opening, but I haven't seen it much from Hikaru Nakamura, and it's also his opponent's pet opening. Karjakin, the world's leading expert in the Queen's Indian, so therefore I thought it was a bit of a curious choice to play against Karjakin on his territory. Karjakin goes for the main line g3 to fianchetto his bishop. Nakamura plays the main move bishop a6. This move looks a little funny at first sight. What's this bishop doing here? Why he's not going to blunder this pawn? But it is well established because all the ways to cover the pawn on c4 have a bit of a drawback. For example, all the queen moves like queen c2, queen b3, queen a4 have been played, but queen c2, let's say, loses sight over the d5 square, and after c5 white can only play d5 by sacrificing a pawn, which is not everybody's cup of tea. Similarly, queen a4, well, the queen on b3 is a little clumsy and sometimes can be attacked further with knight c6, knight a5. I could go through the whole list. Knight bd2 is also legal, but once again does not control this square. And therefore, Karjakin chooses the main move, the move b3, where at least now you can meet c5 with d5 if you so choose. b3 is met with bishop b4 check, another little subtlety. The point is white has to go bishop to d2, and now this bishop retreats, and what black is arguing is that this bishop on d2 is not well placed and would rather be on c1, from where it could go to his natural home on b2, where from d2 it can go to c3, but that's a worse square. So I hope that more or less explains these slightly strange looking moves played in the opening. It is all mainstream theory. As the next move, bishop to g2, there is an alternative here as well. Sometimes white tries knight c3 nowadays, keeping the option of going e2, e4 very early on. But that's a different story. Bishop g2. And the next small surprise for me is Nakamura's move d5 here. This move does not have the best reputation. We sometimes see it even at the highest level, but it's much more common to play c6 first. The idea is to play d5 and then recapture with the c-pawn, which of course you can't do if you go d5 immediately. Here there's lots of theory battles around lines like bishop c3, d5, knight bd2, or castles, d5, queen c2. That's a story for another day, but amongst the very best, this has a better reputation than the immediate d5. Drawback of d5 is that white now takes, black should recapture with a pawn, and this structure is not terrible for black, but it's a little suspect. He has less pawns in the center. White has the d and e pawn, black only has the d pawn, and this construction with the pawn on c7 and the pawn on b6 does leave a bit of a hole on c6. So this structure is not trusted by most top guys. It's playable, but it's supposed to be a little worse for black. White goes short castles, knight to c3. And Nakamura plays another move that is slightly rare, considering this position is already slightly rare. He goes for knight bd7, which looks very natural. But most players who play this regularly, they prefer to delay this move and sometimes even go bishop b7 first, keeping the option open of bringing this knight out via a6, from where it can maybe support a c5 advance. It can also cover the c7 pawn for now. And then later, after c5 or c6, the knight often can regroup to c7 and e6. I'm not sure if that's better or worse than knight bd7, but knight bd7 is a little less common. White has tried pretty much every move under the sun after knight bd7. Bishop f4, bishop c1, knight e5, knight h4. I'm sure I could think of more. Rook e1, but Karjakin chooses a very natural move. The move queen to c2, clearing this d1 square for his rook, because ideally white wants to put a rook on d1 and then the other one probably on c1. Now black has to decide what to do next. In general, the question black tends to face in the structure is how he wants to resolve the situation on the queen side. Does he want to play c6 and sort of sit and wait? Does he want to leave the pawn on c7? Normally you can't do that forever. Or do you want to go c5? When after d takes c5, which often happens, you have a choice if you want to play with an isolated pawn by recapturing with a piece, or with what we call the hanging pawns after dc5, bc5. That very much depends on the concrete position on the board, if white is in time to put pressure on these pawns. But in general, both these structures are not that appealing to black, so that's one reason why this line is not that popular. Nakamura for now decides to improve his position, goes rook to e8, very natural move, keeping an eye on the e2 pawn and also preparing to maneuver this knight around to e6. Karjakin goes rook ft1, no surprise there, and knight f8 as mentioned. This knight immediately wants to go to e6, which is a better square, but it has one small drawback as well. From f8, this knight loses sight of the e5 square. Karjakin immediately jumps there, goes knight e5, which threatens to win the two bishops with knight to c6, followed by knight takes e7. Black can't allow that, so he has to parry it by going bishop b7, which is part of his plans normally anyway. This bishop wasn't doing that much on a6. Now another instructive moment. Rook ac1 might look like the obvious move, but that rook from c1 can often get chased away by bishop a3. And also, this bishop does not have a lot of work in this position. Therefore, Karjakin plays a nice maneuver. He plays the move bishop c1, bring this bishop to his rightful home on b2, which also helps with the fact that after knight e6, this pawn is under attack, at least as long as there's bishop here. But now it's automatically defended by the white rook. Knight e6 was played anyway, bishop b2 and bishop d6, typical move, threatens a little trick with knight takes d4, followed by bishop takes e5, and also keeps an eye on the c7 pawn. The drawback is, in some lines this bishop can be vulnerable to knight b5 jumps, but for now Karjakin parries the threat of knight takes d4 by going e3. And this is a bit of a decision time for Hikaru Nakamura. He's made all the useful moves to improve his position, and now he has to face these questions I mentioned earlier, what to do about the pawn structure. He decided on a6 to cover the b5 square and to prepare the advance c5. He was later critical of it and said he should have played c5 immediately, which could run into some pretty unpleasant things though, one of those being the move knight to c4, exploiting the fact that the pawn on d5 is pinned and threatening knight takes d6. If this bishop goes somewhere, let's say bishop f8, d takes c5, now b takes c5, this pawn is already quite vulnerable, and this is a good version of these hanging pawns. Karjakin mentioned the move queen to f5, attacking this pawn with the cute little point that after g6, white has a powerful queen sacrifice. Queen takes f6, believe it or not, for just one piece. But after queen f6, knight d5, turns out that white is winning, because if black does not give his queen back, next move will be knight f6 check. Let's say queen f5, knight f6, whatever, king h8, knight takes e8 check, and white just picks up way too much material. This bishop is also on priest. So this line would just lose for black. Not forced, of course, but an interesting line mentioned by Karjakin. I do think that Nakamura should not have played for the advanced c5 at all here and should have played the move c6, a little more passive, but just maintaining the position. Then put the queen on e7, put a rook on d8 or c8 and take it from there. It's not obvious what white would do. Probably strengthen this knight on e5 with f4, queen e7, whatever, rook c1, rook d8 or rook c8, I'm not sure. And play such a position where black is solid. I still slightly prefer white, but it's not completely obvious how white wants to break through here. e4 is hard to prepare. Plans on the queen side are very slow as well, and the king side attack pushing these pawns is also very double-edged. So I believe Nakamura should have played like that, but maybe it is a little too passive for his liking, and he went for the move a6 to stop knight b5 and to prepare c5. Karjakin spent the tempo that he was gifted by a6 on knight e2, hinting at knight to c6 and more or less forcing Nakamura's hand. Nakamura plays c5 and d takes c5, the easiest way to play, asking black what structure he would like. Of course, fully knowing that both of the structures that black can get are not that great for him. Once again, knight c4 was an interesting move to go dc5 later, but Karjakin plays it simple, dc5, keeping the option of knight c4 in reserve should black go b takes c5, which he didn't. And probably rightly so, because here knight c4 is indeed very, very unpleasant. This bishop has to go somewhere, probably e7, and now white can just increase the pressure on the d5 pawn by, for example, doubling rooks along the d file. And this is not a nice situation for black. And therefore, Nakamura decided to capture on c5 with the knight accepting an isolated pawn on d5, which is probably the right decision here, but still leads to a long-term positional advantage for white, which I'm sure Karjakin was happy to have. He retreated his knight, went knight d3. Nakamura put his knight on the most active square, knight ce4, keeping an eye on the f2 pawn. But now the position is clarified, and white is obviously better positionally. Natural move rook c1, rook c8, queen b1. This queen might look a little passive, but it has a lot of good work. Can go to a1 and put pressure along this long diagonal, so it's not really a problem for white. Once again, a natural move by Nakamura. He goes queen e7, connecting his rooks. Now white has to think about what to do next. You could, of course, exchange a pair of rooks and go rook c1. But probably Karjakin was worried that without rooks there's not enough winning potential left in this position, and he wanted more. He therefore decided on the move bishop to d4. You could also put the knight on d4, but bishop d4 is attacking the b6 pawn and he's fishing for weaknesses on the black queen side. And he was successful. Nakamura decided to meet it with rook takes c1, rook takes c1 and b5, solving the problem of this weak pawn, but also weakening his c5 square. And that is another thing that could become a long-term problem for black. Instead, nothing's very pleasant. He could have played a move like knight d7, maintaining the status quo, or maybe even bishop c5. But white keeps pretty stable plus in all the lines. This is a position where with a single move you really can't shift the evaluation. White is just better positionally. So bishop d4, Nakamura took and went b5. Karjakin decided to fix this c5 square by going b4 with some tempting alternatives. a4, for example, look very interesting as well, trying to open the queen side and creating a further black weakness there. But Nakamura decides to play it slowly, goes b4. And what follows is very sensible maneuvering. Sorry, not Nakamura, Karjakin. What follows is very sensible maneuvering by Nakamura. He's trying to improve his knight from f6, which doesn't really have a future. The colleague is already on e4, so he's trying to bring it to the e6 square. Karjakin plays it slow, goes a3, keeping the structure intact. Knight to f8. And now he's anticipating this knight coming to e6. You don't want to exchange this powerful bishop for a black knight, so the bishop retreats before it gets hit. Knight e6 anyway, and Karjakin continues his policy to do nothing too forcing, goes queen a2. Nice little improving move, keeping an eye on the d5 pawn, and some lines maybe now one of the knights to f4 hitting this pawn, or knight to c3 could become an option. Once again, there's different ways white could have played. Knight d4 is always a possibility here. White maintains a bit of an edge, but queen a2 is a nice little move. Just asking black what he want to do next. Nakamura is up for the task. He goes bishop c7, tries to improve his bishop, put it on its best square on b6, from where it potentially could support some ideas, even with knight takes f2 and staring at the e3 pawn. But that's not going to happen. Of course, Karjakin does not allow this bishop a clear view to his monarch, blocks the diagonal by going knight d4. Nakamura goes bishop b6. Now he's improved his position as far as he could. He's still worse, but he's done well over the last couple moves. Karjakin plays a move which I struggle to understand, the move h2 to h4, controlling the g5 square, but I'm not sure it was a problem for him that any piece could have gone there, so I'm really not sure what this is about. But I'm a bad h4 player. These strong players, they like playing h4 in all kinds of situations, and I'm very often confused about it. Now the natural move was to move the colleague of the h-pawn, the a-pawn, going a4, trying to chip away a bit at the black structure on the queen side, when white keeps a stable edge. And he keeps that edge even if these pieces are exchanged here. White is also settled with an isolated pawn, because now his pieces are just stronger. The bishop on g2 is stronger than the bishop on b7, the knight on d3 is stronger than the knight on e4, so white maintains an advantage here. Black's position is not hopeless, but it certainly is unpleasant. In the game, h4 was played, as mentioned. H4 was played. Once again, Nakamura could have gone for this simplifying operation, and he probably should have gone for it when he's worse, but the position remains defendable. Queen f6, targeting this pawn, for example, queen b2, some move h6, and yeah, it's gonna be suffering because there's so many weak squares, but it ain't over by any stretch. Instead, Nakamura spotted a tactical chance here. He saw that h4 weakened the g3 pawn, and he decided to go for an unexpected shot. Knight takes g3. Little combination. The point is after f takes g3, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, e takes d4. Black goes queen e3 check, and it looks like he's winning his piece back and even won a pawn. This knight can't go away because that drops the rook on c1. Therefore, white has to do something else. But Karjakin went for this line and did something else, and it turns out that what he did is just winning, because Nakamura's combination had a hole after queen f2. Queen takes d3 is forced. White goes rook to c7, which decides the game. It's a double attack against b7 and f7. Queen takes f7 is threatening mate in 2, and you can't cover that and keep your bishop. So knight takes g3 really was just a blunder, which is rare at this level, and especially rare for such a great calculator as Nakamura. And yeah, he's been defending very patiently and well, but he does ruin all the fruits of his labor by going knight takes g3. This was played, and after rook c7, it's pretty much resigns. The game continued for a bit, but it's just agony because black loses a full piece. He played f5, rook takes b7. This pawn is gonna drop as well. And the next moves, yeah, are easy enough. Bishop takes d5, king h7. Many ways lead to Rome here. Karjakin decided for bishop g2. And this was a good practical decision because it did end the game pretty much immediately. Nakamura went for rook e2. Might as well try for some activity, but Karjakin had of course seen that coming, and he prepared the sneaky little move bishop f1, pinning this rook, thereby forcing an exchange of queens. And since rook takes f2, bishop d3 is just totally hopeless, being a full piece down. Nakamura resigned after bishop f1. So full point for Sergei Karjakin, and a strange game. Of course, with hindsight, it's much easier to criticize any of the decisions. I was surprised by Nakamura going for the Queen's Indian and then going for the structure with d5, cd5, ed5, which, yeah, is supposed to be a little suspect, and judging by his moves, he wasn't that comfortable in it. Then the next moment I thought, instead of this a6, c5 plan, c6 might have been a better way to handle the position, but I could be wrong about that. Then white had a stable plus throughout the game, went for this move h4, which I found strange, but it turns out that it won him the game instantly because it provoked knight takes g3, which just loses. Instead, knight takes d4 would have left its drawing chances very much intact. So full point for Sergei Karjakin. We're gonna look at the standings now. If you don't want to know the standings because you want to check out the other games first, then switch off this video right here, right now, because here they come. 3, 2, 1 standings. And we do see that Vishy Anand got company in the lead by Sergei Karjakin, both on 1.5 out of 2. Familiar sight, because Vishy Anand won the last candidates tournament ahead of Sergei Karjakin, who finished second. No one else has won a game yet, but of course there's still 12 rounds to play, so anything can still happen. The field is very tightly matched. If that's English, who knows. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Till then, bye bye.